Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by Farmers Web.
Farmers Web software gives you the tools you need to manage your entire sales process. Built specifically for farmers' needs, Farmers Web helps you save time, reduce errors, increase efficiency, and provides flexibility for working seamlessly with your whole customer base. Our free account includes features for sharing your real-time and coming soon product availability, as well as the option to create an availability calendar to inform buyers about your product's seasonality. Free accounts also include access to Farmers Web's how-to guides, offering pro tips and best practices on selling online to individual buyers, as well as how to work with such buyers as restaurants, schools, and stores. A 1-month free trial is available for the paid account, which includes all features to manage customers and orders, including accepting online credit card sales, handling advanced pickup or delivery orders, giving select buyers special pricing and payment terms, tracking your buyers' payments, keeping detailed sales records, and much more. Even manage orders and payments for buyers not placing their orders online. Request a demo and learn more at farmersweb.com.
Today's episode is also brought to you by Growers & Co., who are offering No-Till Market Garden podcast listeners 15% off on orders $150 US for use on all clothing, tools, accessories, and the magazine. That offer code is No-Till-Growers15, all one word, no caps, No-Till-Growers15. I will put it in the show notes as well. That offer code is valid through December 30th, 2020. It can be used at growers.co, which, for the uninitiated, is a clothing, tool, and apparel company that makes clothing for the growers who do precisely this kind of work. If you are a market gardener or an aspiring one, Growers & Co. has designed their products around your needs. The goal of Growers & Co. is to be a brand that represents the dignity, skills, and creativity required to do this work. Learn more and use that code, again, No-Till-Growers15, at growers.co. All right, let's jam. Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, Episode 10, Season 3. Got a great episode for you this week with Ginny Love of Love and Fresh Flowers in Philadelphia, PA. Ginny grows 3 acres of flowers right in the city. So we talk about how she scored that land. We talk about her transition from tillage to no tillage and why. You will remember that Ginny joined me in the summer for a summer short on Living Pathways, which was one of the most popular of the year. In fact, got a lot of wheels turning for me. Also, over the past 3 seasons, we've had a lot of requests for more flower content. So today, we remedy that in more ways than one, but that'll make more sense as you listen to the episode. Make sure you are subscribed to this podcast wherever you are getting it. And as always, support our work at patreon.com/no-till-growers. One note on my audio: if my side sounds like it was recorded in an empty auditorium, it sort of was, except instead of an auditorium, it was our empty house that we just moved into. So anyway, apologies for that. All right, enough from me. Let's get into this amazing conversation with Ginny Love of Love and Fresh Flowers. Ginny Love, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Jesse. I'm excited to be here yet again. We've got a lot to talk about today.
Oh my gosh, so much to talk about. Okay, so we had you on this summer to talk about Living Pathways, but I wanted to bring you back on so that we could dive into the rest of your operation a little bit and some other things that we have going on. But first, give us a little bit more of a farm rundown. Remind us, where are you located, what size acreage you're working on, and those sorts of things.
Sure, definitely. My farm is located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and it is zone 7/6B or whatever the heck the weather feels like giving us on a given day. We really do seem to be in a crazy climate shift here in right here in Philadelphia. So before we were a fairly like nice, normal, really great growing season. But over the past couple of years, we've turned into what's essentially a temperate rainforest, which is a whole new ballgame because of our rainfall levels. So that's been challenging. But in a nutshell, it's essentially zone 7. The farm is located right in Philadelphia, so it is an urban farm within the city limits of Philadelphia. I started farming in 2008 and have been farming the property that I have now since 2010. And it's currently, I have access to 6 acres. And yes, I actually have 6 acres in the city of Philadelphia.
Wow.
But I'm farming, whenever people ask me exactly how much is in production, it's hard because I shift I've been expanding, over the years, basically. So I think it's about 3.25 acres at the moment. It might be 3.5. I haven't actually walked it off in a while. And we're an entirely flower-based farm. So we don't do any veggies. Although thanks to COVID, I did start growing vegetable starts to sell. But generally, I'm a flower farmer. And yeah, we grow a mix of annuals, perennials, and woody crops. And my focus primarily is on perennials and woodies whenever possible. I do grow annuals just to have enough stems coming off the field, but my passion is for perennials and woody crops. And pre-COVID, our main sales channels were weddings and floral design. So my operation, Love and Fresh Flowers, is what is termed a farmer florist operation. And that means that the stems that I grow at my farm, we also design in-house to sell the way a florist would. And so, yeah, that was pre-COVID. And then thanks to COVID, everything has changed. But that's probably another conversation for another time. And my farm has been, thanks to that temperate rainforest shift that we've been having. In 2018, I was essentially forced to go no-till because we had pretty much the wettest year ever on record, and it was impossible to till. And prior to that, I had been tilling with a tractor and a 3-point hitch tiller on the back. And since 2018, I've given up tilling and went cold turkey, which may have been for the best or for the worst. It's definitely presented some challenges, but I'm really learning. And I've found myself extremely passionate about this idea of soil health and soil balance. And I'm just super curious about it. So I've been trying to do as much research as possible and develop new systems, since no-till hasn't been super prominent in flower farming until pretty recently, actually. So that's the farm in a nutshell, I think.
Yeah. So what's the story with this property? Like, how did the 6 acres kind of come into existence for you? That's a really amazing score.
Yeah, it is. I feel incredibly fortunate, but then I also have to remind myself that I worked very hard for it. But so I started out actually in a community garden plot, a very tiny community garden plot. So if anybody listening is curious about how to start a flower farm or even a veggie farm, I would assume, you can do it on a tiny piece of land. So what I started on was 1/16 of an acre.
Wow.
And so that was, a community garden plot. But then in the process of doing that, I realized how, like, I kind of like hit a niche that was so ready to explode. Um, and I couldn't keep up with demand for the flowers that I was growing, so I immediately went looking for more land as quickly as possible. And I tried to partner with all sorts of nonprofit organizations to take over like parking lots and things like that, which I look back on now and think, wow, I was an idiot. But it's okay. I mean, there's value in that, but I could never have built the business that I did. But long story short, through this, I just kind of put it out to the universe, like, hey, universe, I'm looking for land. And I made sure to tell anybody I knew that I was looking for land in the city. And one of my friends, her name's Nicole, and she happened to know this guy named Sam who happened to have a property that it was a 4-acre property that Sam owns. And he was looking for a farmer because he had his house, but then he had all this land that was overwhelming to him to take care of. It was just getting overgrown. And he had tried to grow potatoes on it at one point, but and so anyway, I met with Sam and we made an arrangement, and that was back in, wow, 2010. So I got an acre of land through him, and then that property happened to be surrounded by lots of other wide open space that was owned by private landowners as well. And of course, I made sure to make really good friends with all those other landowners. So I left them bouquets and tried to tell them what I was about. And through the course of making those friendships, I was able to add more of their properties to my growing space as well. And then in 2018, I had the good fortune of one of those properties came up for sale. And it's a 4-acre property that did not was never developed in the city of Philadelphia. So I have about 2 acres of wooded lot and 2 acres of literally premium farmland in Philadelphia that I bought in 2018. And I've been really working on that particular piece of property in the past 2 years to bring it into production. And all of this land exists, which I find really fascinating because it was farmland since colonial times when William Penn claimed the land for his own. So it was William Penn's farmland. And before that, it's unceded Lenape land prior to that. So I do think it's actually been farmed, since maybe prehistoric times, which is pretty phenomenal to me. But that's how I got the land ultimately.
So I love that. I want to talk. I know you said that we could talk about the COVID stuff later, but I kind of want to hear about it because it's super interesting to me, especially because your markets are so different than mine. Talking about like, what did the farmer florist thing look like after COVID? Because I'm assuming maybe you said this, like weddings and those sorts of things, events. What was that trend like? What are you doing now? What was that transition like?
Yeah, it was brutal. The transition was brutal. I'm not gonna lie. So to give in sort of broad strokes here, prior to 2020 or going into 2020, really. So when you're a farmer florist and you're doing weddings or any florist, you generally book your weddings a year to 6 months in advance. So this has been really great for my business as a farmer because it lets me know what my income is going to be well in advance, which I think is one of the most wonderful aspects of being a farmer florist. Because unlike a farmer that goes to a farmer's market and you hope for the best, I actually have contracts for sales, months and months in advance. So up until 2020, this was a wonderful aspect of my business. And then 2020 hit, and we already had I think we had 42 weddings in total that were scheduled for 2020. And my wedding season runs from the last week of March to the third week in October. I am a seasonal grower. I don't do any winter growing, or at least no winter blooms. And so we only do weddings in a smaller window of time. And of course, COVID, our lockdown here in Philadelphia, started on March 13th, 1 week before my first wedding of the season. And so it's been, I'm not going to lie, Jesse, it was an emotional roller coaster of a year because the challenge of being a farmer florist who works on weddings is that you have these standing contracts, which are great in good times, but they're terrible when you're a farmer trying to pivot because what was happening is all these weddings were trying to reschedule and shift. It turned into some sort of messy contractual conversations. We ended up having 2 weddings cancel outright. 35 of them moved to 2021. And we just did a handful of really small ones. The tricky part was that here I was trying to juggle all these contracts that I couldn't walk away from. These are people that they give you a really big, retainer for your services, a deposit, well in advance. So to walk away from these contracts, I would have lost thousands of dollars. But at the same time, I couldn't really move forward with a more concrete new sales channel. So I had to remain really, really flexible. I had to find ways to sell flowers every week, to keep the farm in production, to keep my employees paid, while still being super flexible enough to at a moment's notice basically produce a wedding whenever one of these clients decided they wanted to actually get married. Yeah, so that was tough. But in the end, what we did is we leaned on the community that surrounds my farm, which I mean, if I talk about it too much, I'll actually get a little choked up. The community that surrounds my farm is amazing. They stepped up. We've had a CSA for over a decade, a flower 100% flower CSA. And I had members in the past, maybe I would, the CSA wasn't a big part of my business. I was really focused on weddings. So in the past, we would have about 20 or so members, rolling through the CSA at a given time. But then once I knew COVID was here to stay, I really pushed the CSA. So we grew that to about 3 times the size that it was before. And then also introduced something called Porch Petals, which is a contactless delivery service, which was something I swore I would never ever do. Like the idea of doing deliveries made me want to crawl into a cave and disappear. Because in the floral world, there's a bad reputation for deliveries because people tend to want their money back, or they're not home and the flowers die on the steps or whatever. So there's a lot of challenges with flower delivery. But it worked. It worked beautifully. I set it up so that we only deliver to a very small radius. It's 5 zip codes. We are in the city, so 5 zip codes is, thousands of people. But it's a pretty small area. It's about a 5-mile radius from our farm, radiating out from our farm. And what was nice about the Porch Petals is that it was a week-to-week sales model. So I unlike the CSA, which is a standing system where we, if you've got members, you've got to provide something for the members. The Porch Petals allowed me to be super flexible. So in weeks that we ended up having a wedding, they were always small, but if we had one, then I could rein in the Porch Petals. If we didn't have anything that week, then I could really push the Porch Petals. And it's fantastic. That's here to stay, actually, the Porch Petals system, because it is by far probably, aside from weddings, the most profitable sales channel and efficient sales channel I've ever developed for my business. So those are sort of the ways COVID has really changed things. And then next year, I mean, now we have an insane number of weddings on the books for 2021 because we had to push those 35 from this year to next year. And I'm not sure what 2021 is going to look like. It's going to be a wild ride in and of itself too. In the wedding business, we're being told, those of us in the wedding industry, that we are not going to see quote unquote normal weddings again until 2022. So it's a long and wild ride that we're on right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. What a story. I mean, hearing your community come together for the CSA thing is really amazing. I love that is still happening in flower production as much as it's happening in vegetables. That's super cool to hear. Are you going to be taking contracts in 2021? Like, I know you said you weren't totally sure, but you have all these weddings coming up. Like, are you going to?
So what we are doing is we are taking contracts for 2021 because, for all intents and purposes, I'm still locked into weddings for next year. My farm is locked into weddings because we do have 35 contracts for next year, whether I want to or not, because they're all the 2020 weddings that have shifted. So I still have to have a farm that is producing for weddings coming next year. My real question mark right now is 2022. Do I want to continue into 2022 with weddings? Or am I shifting and changing accordingly? So I only will book weddings 1 year out at the most. And if anybody's listening and considering getting into wedding work, I would strongly encourage you to never sign a contract for longer than 12 months, because it just locks you in. You can't make any changes or shifts to your business model if you don't want to do them anymore. And for what it's worth, I do want to do weddings still, but I'm sort of, I got some post-traumatic stress, like I got a little PTSD I got to work through first because it was incredibly exhausting this year. But I do think we'll continue. But as far as 2021, yeah, we're still a wedding farm for now. And for what it's worth, the crops you grow for weddings are entirely different than the crops you grow for retail sales, like a CSA model or a home delivery service. So that's what also makes it really tricky is I have to completely change my crop scheduling and my crop plan if I want to shift gears. Yeah.
Wait, elaborate on that. What's the difference? I don't know that I know.
Yeah, well, Okay, so it's not like you can't use a zinnia in a wedding bouquet. You could, so like zinnias would be a prime example that I'm pretty sure everybody knows what a zinnia is. You can grow zinnias and use them in weddings. But they're not like a high value, their perceived value is pretty low. And when you're trying to do weddings, at least the weddings that I try to do. So we're located here in Philadelphia and it's a high-end wedding market. And I long ago set out to be a premium wedding florist in this city. So I don't want to take budget brides or not. I mean, there's definitely a place for people who want to stay on a tighter budget. But the overhead for my farm in the city is so high that I knew I needed to target clients who wanted, high-end florals. So in that case, they're not really going to be excited about zinnias, but they will be excited about something like a little tiny delicate flower called didiscus, or it's otherwise known as lace flower, which is one of the flowers that I love to grow as a florist. It's really beautiful. It sets my design work apart when I make a bridal bouquet with didiscus in it and geums and some of these other sweet little somethings. That's when people are willing to pay a lot of money for a bridal bouquet or a centerpiece or whatever. But those flowers, they have a very short vase life. So something as flower farmers we worry about is vase life. And that means just how long will the flower last in a design. And when you're doing wedding flowers, you only need those flowers to basically live for one day. I mean, the ideal would be to get them to live longer than one day, but you can use flowers that only live for one day. So, another prime example of that would be Icelandic poppies or other kinds of poppies. They only look good for about a day and then they drop their petals. That's just the way they are. Although for the record, Icelandic poppies do actually last longer than one day, but they're fussy. Uh, so so those are the kind of flowers you can put into weddings, but then you would never send those flowers to somebody getting a birthday arrangement or something like that, or a CSA bucket, because they're going to be really mad that they didn't get their money's worth because the flowers died after one day. So you want to look for flowers to send out for retail that will last a very long time. So in that scenario, you want to do things like some of my premium flowers that I like to do for that, or something like Alstroemeria. Like this is a really common flower that most people, if they got it in their wedding flowers, would be like, why is this here? But Alstroemeria will last, like 3 weeks in a vase in a house. So those are the kind of differences. It's both perceived value and then vase life. So there really is a stark difference between the type of flowers you would grow for a wedding and the type of flowers you would grow for retail sales like farmers market or CSA. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Does that make sense?
No, that totally makes sense. And I do know what zinnias are. So I'm happy that I could had some
Woohoo!
context. I'm happy I had some context there.
Good.
Okay, so I want to talk about vase life for a second because I read about this in Lynn Basinski's book.
Yep.
And do you have what are the pro tips for vase life? You just mentioned kind of variety matters. What else is there?
Yeah, definitely. So variety is perhaps the number one critical piece of the puzzle. And a lot of flower farmers need to understand that, especially newer growers who don't don't necessarily realize that right away, that not all flowers are created equal for vase life. So you first need to understand what potential vase life a flower could have. And then after that, some general tips are you want to harvest early in the morning. That means the flowers are really well hydrated. They're not hit by the heat yet. So flowers really prefer to be harvested early in the morning. We stop harvesting at my farm by 11 a.m. We won't pick after that. So that's one thing to consider. You also want to get them into a cooler. Generally speaking, most cut flowers want to go into a cooler. There are some exceptions. One of those exceptions is zinnias that we just talked about. They don't want to go into cooler. Neither does Lisianthus or Celosia. Those are some other ones. But generally speaking, most flowers would like to go into a cooler. And so that's a walk-in cooler that's set around, my cooler fluctuates through the season based on if it's cool springtime or hot summer. You got to think like a flower. They don't, the cool spring flowers enjoy really cold temperatures, but the hot summer flowers do not enjoy really cold temperatures. So the range in the cooler changes across the season, but it's anywhere from 33 degrees, so that's basically almost freezing, to 42 degrees. And so when you put your flowers in the cooler, generally speaking, you should sit them in for at least overnight. And while they're in the cooler, what's going to be happening is they're going to be hydrating. They're going to suck up as much water as possible. They're going to get used to this new lifestyle they have, which is basically being amputated at the knees. And they were used to being on a plant, now they're not on a plant, but they still need to suck up water. So this is the difference between, like vegetable production and flower production is like once you uproot a carrot, I mean, yeah, you got to keep it like nice and crunchy and fresh, but it's not the same as a flower. A flower really, 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 really needs to drink a lot of water to stay looking like a flower. So it needs about 12 to 24 hours to hydrate in a cooler. That will really help with vase life. And then once it's hydrated, you do always want to keep it out of sunlight. So even when you pull it out of the cooler, don't set it in a bright sunny spot. So keep it dark. And then from there, it's just best to think about your water. So water is a major, major piece of flower farming. Not only with irrigation, but most of the water I use in my farm is actually in the buckets. So the buckets that we harvest into. So the quality of your water has a lot to do with vase life. So here in Philadelphia, my farm actually has a well, so I'm also super lucky in that way. So I don't have to deal with city water, but anybody who's in a city would have to deal with highly chlorinated water. In that case, you want to draw the water out, put it in buckets, and let it sit for 24 hours so that chlorine can gas off of the water, because the flowers won't like it, and the fluoride in it as well. But if you're on a well, then you should get your water tested and find out what quality of water you have. That's a whole nother conversation, so I won't go that deep into it. But the quality of water has a big impact on vase life. And then besides that, you want to make sure that it's fresh water. Always, like we tell our customers, you need to change the water in the vase every day or every other day. You need to take a cut off the bottom of the stems every other day or so as well. That just provides fresh tissue for the flowers to suck water up. A stem of a flower is basically a straw. And if that straw gets clogged by bacteria, which is usually what happens, the flower will wilt. The flower at the top of the stem will wilt because the straw can't suck up any water. So you want to make sure the bottom of that straw is always nice, clean cut, fresh, no bacteria clogging it up. And then there's some products that you can use if you want. At my farm, we don't use products in terms of hydration products, some powders, like flower food that you can put into the water. There's definitely grounds for using that in certain situations, but my farm is certified naturally grown. And I'm also just really into the idea of low inputs as much as possible. So we don't use any sort of particular additive to the water in our buckets, nor do we send flower food out to our customers. We just tell them how to take good care of their flowers. And that's pretty much it in a nutshell, I think. That was a long nutshell, big nutshell.
Oh, that's super. That's great. I love that because that's a lot of information that I don't necessarily know. And I love flowers.
Yeah.
We don't grow very many, but I want to grow more. So it's exciting to hear those little tips.
And there's a book, Jesse, just for the record, called Post Harvest Handling, which is a total nerdy book. But if people are interested in learning how to handle every single specific type of flower they're growing, I highly recommend it. It's kind of basically like a textbook for flowers and how to, when to harvest them, what stage to harvest them. Oh, I didn't mention that stage of harvest has a lot to do with vase life as well. You want to pick flowers mostly in the bud stage, in when they're just showing some color. There's different standards for different flowers, but a lot of times, especially newer vegetable growers, or not newer vegetable growers, but vegetable growers new to flower farming, will pick their flowers when they're too old, they're too open. So you tend to look at a flower and think, oh, the bigger the better. But that's not actually the case in terms of if it's wide open and the petals are fully extended and it's, at its prettiest stage, that means it's basically ready to die. It's fulfilled its life cycle and it wants to go to seed at that point. So probably a bee came and pollinated it already. So that flower is ready to drop its petals and move on to seed stage. So what you want to do is be picking your flowers when they are essentially swollen buds or just opened. And that will give them a longer vase life as well. So that's another really important tip. So look up post-harvest handling. I'll find a link to share. And that's a good book to have.
Great. That's great. Can we talk about soil prep?
Oh, sure.
So I want to hear a little bit about the evolution of your practices, because you mentioned you were doing some tillage, 3-point hitch, and then you kind of quit cold turkey when you had a really wet season, which I think was the same year we had a really wet year. We had like 75 inches, I think, in 2018 or 2017.
Yeah, it was 2018. If it's the same year as ours, that was it. Yeah, it was crazy.
It was yeah, that was wild.
Yeah.
Okay, so take us back to that period. Like, how did you transition, and what were some of the effects of that? Like you mentioned, some were good and some were maybe not so good.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great topic. I'll try to rewind my brain to that time. So what was happening is, especially in the spring, it was just pouring rain, and I knew enough about. I mean, I know a lot about soil even prior to going no-till, but I didn't understand soil life so much. But I knew that I should not be taking my tractor out on there. Like I was going to cause serious drainage problems if I decided to till during that weather. So I happened to, I don't know how I heard about it or whatever, but I got a hold of Andrew Mefford's book, the no-till. I can't remember the whole title off the top of my head, but you all know Andrew. And I got a hold of his book, and I was reading through that, and I was listening to your podcast, and I was just trying to figure it out as I went along. I didn't really have any idea what I was doing, but we adopted, for lack of a better system, we adopted a deep mulch system. And I'm not saying it was a bad system. That's just what I went with. I didn't know. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't have tarps or anything. Um, yeah, so bed prep in general was I had been cover cropping, and so I would use my mulching push mower, which is a badass push mower that I love and adore. It's a Poulan 21-inch mulching push mower, which just has a crazy motor on it that keeps going. So I would mow down the because it was too wet. I didn't even want to drive my tractor like on my, across the field because it was so soggy. It was just like a mud pit. So I didn't want to like take my big mower over it. So I was using the push mower to bring down the cover crop, which was winter rye and peas and vetch. And then over that, we were using recycled cardboard that I got out of a appliance store dumpster. So basically, like big boxes for refrigerators and stuff. And we were doing that, and then we were putting. This is the biggest mistake I made. I thought more is better, so I put 4 inches at least of compost on top of the cardboard to build beds. I did not have a broad fork or anything at that time. So that was pretty much it. That's all I did, like just to get the plants in the ground. And certain things it really worked for. There were definitely certain crops that handled that well. And I'm still grateful that I actually got any crops in the ground that year. So it was a win ultimately. But then there were definitely other crops that hated that system. And I just didn't know any different back then, like what the system I had created was doing. So what it was doing is creating layers, very distinct layers. And so things weren't really mixing well. And I was having like a lot of rot, which I just attributed to being a wet season, but it really wasn't. It was mostly because the way I had set it up was that the plant roots weren't really getting below the cardboard at all. And the cardboard, until it broke down, acted as just like a sheeting mechanism, for the water, the downpours were just kind of sort of sitting and sheeting on that cardboard. The compost was super wet. And so there were a lot of rot issues that first year. Since then, I've changed my system a bit. Also, the cardboard that I was using was super thick. So like I said, it was like refrigerator boxes, and it just didn't break down. I also didn't have that much biology in my soil at that time. So one of the things that I had to learn the hard way is that going no-till does not mean your soil is suddenly healthy and alive and doing jumping jacks. It's still dead soil. It's still soil. I had tilled for almost 10 years. So it was still soil that was lifeless, essentially. And then, everybody talks about how great cardboard is for earthworms and, oh my gosh, look at all these earthworms that come. Well, my farm didn't even have earthworms, like that's sadly how much I had beat up my soil. So there were no earthworms to come up and chew up the cardboard. So that cardboard stuck around all season, which was great for weed management, but not great for, the crop roots just weren't doing a great job of finding the ground, finding their way through that cardboard. So since then, we've adjusted course a bit, and I started using cardboard, thin cardboard, corrugated cardboard that I buy from Uline. It comes in a roll. It's 36 inches wide, which is the size of my beds. And it's really thin. So it's just a good starter cardboard, so to speak, to keep weed suppression down at the beginning of the year. But then it disintegrates pretty rapidly. And now we only put about 2 inches at most of compost on top. So when we're planting, the roots of the transplants are really going into the soil now instead of just hanging out in a big mound of compost on top of really thick cardboard. And so we're having it's gotten a lot better now. But in the beginning, that was a big learning curve for me. And just knowing that you have to wait for the soil life to come back. There's a lot of things you can do to bring it back. But at that first year, if you've been tilling, or even if your soil's been really fallow and hasn't been touched very much, you can't assume there's a lot of life in it. You got to kind of coax it out. And then once it gets going, the whole system improves after that. So I think that answered your question. I'm not really sure.
No, that's perfect. It's funny with the cardboard thing. I think, we went through that a couple of years ago when we planted garlic, where we put the cardboard down, put a bunch of compost on top of it, and then started to realize like, oh, this is our first experience with cardboard on that scale. And we just realized like, oh yeah, this is not broken down. There's no way to get through that cardboard. And there are a couple crops that do okay on that, but my fear, in that situation where they don't have pure access to the native soil, lettuce is one. But my fear with that is always like, that's all it has access to. So if the minerals and nutrients that it needs to be fully, nutritionally rich are not in that compost, which sometimes they may be, but sometimes they won't be, then it's not going to photosynthesize well, and it's not ultimately going to create the healthy crop that you need, even if it's successful to an extent, even if it does grow a full crop. So yeah, allowing that cardboard to break down is important. Are you doing those beds, like when you're replenishing a bed or doing the bed, are you doing that all at the same time of year, or are you just kind of doing that as needed?
Well, when we replenish, so we in flower farming, there's a lot of bed flip. So we do a lot of succession sowing here, which means basically, we'll just keep referring to zinnias, so it's so easy. In zinnias, you can basically get about a 3-week harvest of really good, high quality zinnias off of a particular planting, and then you can let them limp along for the entire season if you want. But if you want high quality flowers from something like zinnias, you really need to have another succession of them. So we do about 4 succession plantings of zinnias through the course of the season. And so then when we put the new succession in, we take the old crop out. And so now we have a bit of bed space available for something else. So in that scenario, we're not really, I've not done anything to my beds during the season. So during the season, our system literally is cut the old plant down. So if it's a zinnia, we just take the old plant, cut it at the base, leave the roots in the soil, and then immediately, literally, like the very next thing we do on the farm that day is get a tray of transplants and put them in the ground right next to the old roots of the zinnias or whatever it was, and get that bed replanted. So we don't replenish any cardboard or compost or put any amendments on or anything like that. We just plant right back in. To me, I learned that from listening to your podcast, Jesse, actually, when it was who said that first? I don't know. One of it was a couple of years ago when I was listening, but I can't remember who to credit, and I feel terrible now. But I don't know. I think it was maybe Singing Frogs. I don't know. But somebody mentioned about how, like, yeah, just leave the roots in the ground. Um, and so I don't want to do anything to like disturb those roots, and I want to get something planted right next to those roots right away so that it's basically like a little nursery for those new plants. So they get all the root exudates that are still lingering in the soil there, all the soil life, all the minerals, and then as those roots decay, that's feeding both the soil life and the new plants. And I've just noticed a tremendous difference in our transplant quality, the growth rate. We don't see any transplant shock whatsoever when we do that. So yeah, I don't want to disturb that bed basically mid-season. I want to leave that bed just as it is. So most of our bed prep, all of our bed prep mostly, happens in the spring. So we just do cover crop over the winter. In the spring, I now use tarps in the spring to kind of take the life out of a cover crop, but I try not to actually kill it. I try to just weaken it, then mow it, then thin cardboard, thin layer of compost, just to, essentially shade out the cover crop, keep it from coming back. But I want its roots alive. So when we plant into the soil, those transplants that are going into that cover crop are getting all that good nursery boost, so to speak, in that stage. And then the beds just stay in place and go untouched until the fall when I go back through and I broadcast cover crop seed over any bed that's done for the season. And then the cycle repeats.
Hey, you all, just jumping in real quick to get a word from our sponsors like Tilth Soil. Tilth Soil makes NOP compliant living potting soils in Cleveland, Ohio with food scraps they haul and compost themselves. Each batch of soil is tested against competitors and the results are in. Plants vote for Tilth Soil. Order October through December for the 2021 growing season and get 10% off at tilthsoil.com. This show is also brought to you by you, the listeners. If you're ever like, this information has kind of been super valuable to me, well, we have an amazing place for you to put that energy. Go to patreon.com/no-till-growers and sign up to be a patron. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month, $5, whatever you can afford, or you can pay for a whole year at once now. Super easy, and it's the main funder of what we do, and at a certain level, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Rimmel Greenhouse Systems, Scott Snodgrass, Jean-Martin Fortier, Paris Willett, Christine Albrecht, and Asia Smith. Big thank you to everyone who supports the show, even if it is just a few bucks over at Venmo to say thanks to @NoTillGrowers. However you can support it, we always appreciate it. But check out the Patreon route, patreon.com/no-till-growers, and thanks. Back to Jenny. Are you doing anything with the cover crops? Are you doing kind of rye, vetch, just your typical sort of winter over?
Yeah, yeah, mostly it's rye, vetch, triticale, peas, cowpeas. I mean, that's not actually, well, I guess they do over winter. They kind of die out here. But yeah, just a mix of whatever I got going on. I do a lot of buckwheat in the summer. That's my number one go-to in the summer. I'm doing a fair amount of tillage radish this year in my aisles. So one of the things that I've discovered over time is that this might be like, you probably, like Jesse would be like, duh, Jenny, what are you talking about? This is so obvious. But I thought when you stop tilling, the soil would structure itself, kind of like put the puzzle pieces back together and everything would really flow. And I didn't realize, just how my soil doesn't want to be super fluffy on its own accord. It just doesn't. It's got a magnesium calcium ratio that's out of whack. I need to fix that. But basically, what I'm having is drainage issues, even though I'm not tilling, and I don't think it's like a hard pan underneath because there's the aisles. Like I didn't till the aisles, so I'm trying to use tillage radishes to open up some water holes, basically in my aisles. So that's a new system I'm doing, or a new thing I'm trying to do. So there's that, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Oh, one thing to mention, cover crop wise for flower farmers that might be of interest is there's two cover crops that I actually can treat as a cash crop as well, which are really helpful. And one of them is dwarf sorghum, which makes amazing biomass, and the roots are fantastic for the soil, but also happens to have a really cute seed head, which is great for bouquet making. So we can use sorghum in the bouquets. And then the other one that I really like is mustards. So I will thickly sow a mustard cover crop and let it go to flower. And you can use the flowers in bouquet making as well. So that's another really good cover crop for flower farmers in particular, and good for the bees too.
Yeah, that's great. I love the dual purpose.
Yeah.
Okay, so can we go through one crop, at least one
Yeah,
crop?
sure. Yeah.
We talked about Lysianthus. Maybe you could
Yeah.
give us the rundown on Lysianthus.
Sure. Yeah. Lysianthus is one of those like, oh crap, I really screwed that up with, with no till in the beginning. So Lysianthus, for anybody who doesn't know, it's actually a Native American, it's native to America flower. It's a prairie flower. It's native out in the prairies. It is a very much used and much loved flower crop for flower farmers. It looks like a rose, but it has no thorns, and it doesn't, roses tend to wilt and die after a few days in a vase. Lysianthus can last in a vase about 3 weeks or more. So it's one of those ones that is really worth growing, especially if you're doing farmers market bouquets or something like that. It's also a premium wedding flower. It's one of those few flowers that will cross over between weddings and retail, which is great. So for what it's worth, I like tripled my Lysianthus this coming year because I figure I can use it no matter what I want to do. So anyway, it's a tricky crop that often throws new flower farmers for a loop. So a couple things to know about Lysianthus. One is never grow it from seed. I pride myself in growing as many of my crops from seed as possible. And I mean from seed, meaning in transplant trays, not direct seeded, not out in the field, but just from seed. Um, but Lysianthus is one of the crops I do not grow from seed because it takes forever to grow from seed. So basically, if you want to grow Lysianthus from seed yourself, you'd have to start the seeds now. So mid-December, well, we're chatting in mid-December, I realize. Maybe not everybody knows. So you have to start the seeds in mid-December and keep them in trays on heat mats under lights or in a greenhouse or whatever. You have to keep them happy until April. So that's like, at least, almost 5 months of babying those things in trays before you can put them out in the ground. And then they don't actually produce blooms until mid to late summer. So that's a huge runway of inputs and time and babying that just really isn't worth it, frankly. So, and also the germination rate is usually really spotty. So if you want to grow Lysianthus, my number one tip to start with is buy plugs, buy transplants in instead of trying to grow them yourself. So this is a really common practice in the flower farming world. I'm not sure if it's common in veggies. Is it, Jesse? Do you guys ever buy plugs, buy in transplants? Is that a thing?
Yeah, sometimes we've bought them in the past, and it depends on the crop. Like it makes sense for certain things, or
Mm,
if you don't have your greenhouse set up, like you moved onto a new property,
yeah.
it definitely makes sense for like longer season stuff like that. Like onions would be one that you'd start in
Okay.
December. Same kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's like that. So there's a that's what I was looking for, some sort of a bridge between the worlds. But um, So yeah, so you can buy in Lysianthus plugs. There's several different suppliers that you could look towards to get those. If anybody's curious, I'll say that the place that I get mine through is a flower friend of mine named Farmer Bailey. He has a website, farmerbaileysplugs.com. I'm not getting any money for this plug. It's just I like his system. It's easy to use. And then and so then I just order through there. And and then get the plants. For me, I try to get them around April 1st. I want to put them in the ground in April 1st. They're very cold hardy, actually, surprisingly, and they need a cold period to establish their roots prior to they need heat to flower. So that's one of the things they like. They like to be cool to get growing, then they like to be hot to flower. And one of the mistakes I made when I switched to no-till and did that deep mulch system is that I lost a huge portion of my Lysianthus that year to rot. So they do not have the strongest root system whatsoever. They have a really wimpy root system, frankly. And so they are prone to rotting out if the conditions aren't really right for them. So you want to make sure you grow Lysianthus in a well-drained area. They definitely need drainage. But they also don't like to dry out a lot. So they are a little fussy that way. But if you've got really biologically active soil, I've noticed this year I had an amazing Lysianthus crop because my soil is now cranking, and I know how to handle it better. So I really, once the soil is biologically active, I think you'll have a lot more success. But in the beginning, make sure that you've got lots of drainage, and it's good for that. And then what else can I say about Lysianthus? They're very slow growing. Even once they're out of the trays and in the ground, they're super slow growing. So you're going to have to be patient and understand that when you look at them, they're going to laugh at you and say, ha ha ha, we're not growing. Because it's really like annoying when you're first new to Lysianthus and you don't understand that these things just don't move. So they'll sit there from April to about mid-July, early July, around early July, they start to suddenly do something, and you're like, oh, look at that, they're growing. And so just be patient, know that you didn't do anything wrong if they're not working for you yet. So they start as a tiny, tiny little plant. You do need to keep them well weeded. So that's one of the biggest challenges of Lysianthus production is that they absolutely cannot compete with weeds. They just don't have it in them, which I think is ironic since they're a prairie flower and you would assume that they were used to being out there, like competing against grasses and stuff. But for whatever reason, they really don't want to compete against weeds. So you've got to figure out a system to control weeds. So in the past, I've used plastic with holes. You can use landscape fabric with holes if you want, depending on your climate. The deep mulch system does help. What I've been using with compost, that does really help with weeds. You also just got to commit yourself to getting out there once a week and weed that bed. Like you got to put it on the weekly to-do list and never fail with that. And then the thing that I tried this past year, which I think is really interesting, and I'm going to continue to experiment with this, is that we all know, right, Jesse, that nature wants the soil covered. So, you know, the weeds are going to keep coming as long as there's open space. And because Lysianthus are so small and grow so slowly, there's a lot of open space in a bed. So I got this bright idea this past year in 2020 that I would plant something between the Lysianthus to, take up that space so nature wouldn't want to put the weeds in there. And I think it was pretty darn successful. I got to tinker with it. But what I used was radishes, regular good old vegetable grade radishes, not tillage radishes, but just basically the cheapest radish seed I could find. Um, and I just direct sowed that between the Lysianthus about a month after they had been in the ground. So that the Lysianthus definitely got the head start. But then I put the radish in, and I wasn't trying to harvest the radishes for I wasn't going to eat them. I mean, we did eat some of them, but they were just there to take up space. So they stayed small, like they didn't create this big bushy plant that outcompeted the Lisianthus. Then once they did start to put on so much foliage, we would take them out. Then it was really easy. I mean, radishes are super easy to yank up. And it seemed like my Lisianthus loved that companionship. So I'm going to try to repeat that, but that's just something to tuck in the back of everyone's head, something to do. But weed management is the biggest issue with Lisianthus. And then they flower, depending on where you are, what zone you are and all that, they will flower here in Philadelphia about mid-July. We cut them hard. You got to wait until there's 1 or 2 blooms fully open on the stem. And then they generally have 5 to 8 flowers on each stem. So you wait for 2 of them to be fully open, and then the rest of them will open with time when they're cut and in a bouquet. And then we cut the plants back really hard, but leave the rosette of leaves at the base, at the ground. We fertilize, so I use a foliar feed to perk them back up, make sure they stay weeded, and then they usually do a second flush of blooms that's not quite as good, but is still beautiful to have right when our wedding season is going full blast, which is October. So we can usually get some really beautiful Lisianthus in October, right when I need them for our primo wedding season. So yeah, I think that's it in a nutshell. What questions do you have, Jesse? What didn't make sense?
I think what questions I have is a great question, because I know so little about flowers. Like, I remember when I had Tony Gates on, Tony and Denise Gates of Bear Mountain Farm, that I asked them, what is the radishes of flowers, which is kind of ironic because you were just talking about radishes, but and I should say, call radishes the flowers of vegetables, because I think they're so pretty. But I think throughout this conversation, I've kind of demonstrated my deficiencies in terms of flowers. So I think maybe we should segue that into talking. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you've been up to, what you've been working on.
Yeah, I'm excited about what I've been working on. So this has been in the works, I guess, for a couple months now, secretly behind closed doors. No, I'm just kidding. After our chat in the summer about living walk pathways, which was super fun, and I'm so glad we had that conversation. It seemed to really spark an interest within your own audience as well as mine through Instagram. It was clear that there was a hunger for flower content in relation to no-till farming, and that, those two things coming together. And there has not, I will say this as somebody who jumped into no-till flower farming in 2018 cold turkey, there aren't many resources specific to no-till flower farming. There's such a broad amount of information I feel available for veggie farming and otherwise, but not specific to flower farming. And so, I saw that gap, and I really wanted to fill it. And you were great, and we're gonna partner. So we're launching a new podcast. Woohoo! So there's a new podcast coming this week. I guess it's gonna be, when you guys hear this episode, you're gonna be ready to rock and roll with the No Till Flowers podcast, which I'm hosting. It's launching December 23rd. It's under the umbrella of No Till Growers, which I'm so grateful to Jesse and Jackson for bringing me on board. Because I had so many questions. It's so obvious, I like to dig deep into details. And I had a lot of questions that I wanted to ask other people because I still know, frankly, so little about no-till. I like to think I know a lot, but I recognize I'm a baby at this. And so I just wanted a chance to ask a lot of questions of cool people and then record those conversations so that other people can really kind of get the same information at the same time. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So that's what's coming. A new podcast dedicated to no-till flower farming. And for the record, it's about so much more than no-till flower farming. Now that I've done a lot of these interviews that are coming out, it's going to be about a lot of soil life and soil health and farming, but I think there's a lot more coming out of it, Jesse. I think it's a lot about farmer health and balancing things and anxiety about climate change. And so there's just a lot, there's a lot more to it than just no-till, but every episode's going to have some really nitty gritty detail applicable information about how to tackle no-till flower farming. Yeah.
And we're super excited that you jumped on board with us for this. Super excited to see like what you're able to dig out in terms of flowers, because having edited those first couple podcasts, those first few podcasts, some of the things that I've noticed is like I wouldn't be able to draw out that information, the kind of information that you're able to draw out, and in like what you were just talking about, being sort of broader than just farming and talking about soil health, and also just like in some of the episodes you're talking a little bit about employee management and all these things. It's still different. Like it's still specific to flower production in a way that it can't be for vegetable production. Like we were talking earlier about the weddings. Like there's not a lot of context there for vegetable farmers. We don't do, I mean, maybe some vegetable farmers do weddings, which would be super sweet. But for the most part, like we're not working on those sorts of contracts, especially not at that stress level, like that kind of the anticipation and the amount of work that goes into a wedding. So I love what you're able to draw out that I wouldn't be able to. And we're super excited to put that out there. I'm wondering if before we go, if you could talk about some of the big questions that, for instance, like a vegetable podcast can't answer for a flower grower that you kind of want to answer through your podcast.
Yeah, I think that a couple different things was one of my biggest question marks that I'm still trying to sort out for myself. And I'm not sure that I'm going to find anybody who can answer it, but we'll talk about it a lot. Like I'll be talking about it with everybody. I just want to know what system of no-till. There's so many approaches to no-till. I want to know what system seems to work best for flowers, because flowers are yes, veggies and flowers are all plants, so to speak, but the plants used for flower production are very different than the plants used for vegetable production. So they have different needs. There's also a lot more perennial and woody crops, shrubs is what, woodies mean shrubs, in flower farming. Like that's a huge piece of flower farming that doesn't necessarily exist in the veggie world. Now, granted, I'm going down rabbit holes with fruit production. I look at, orchard management and things like that when I'm trying to find this information. But there's definitely like some missing pieces there that I want to understand production systems as they relate to no-till farming. I mean, to be completely honest, I wanted to find out if no-till is actually the right thing to do for flower farming. Like I understand no-till is good for soil health, and I am so in on that. Like I'm so, so committed, so rooted into that idea. But I don't know, like we're not growing root vegetables and things like that it's different. So basically, I think sometimes no-till maybe can work better for vegetable production because of the root systems that vegetable production involves versus the root systems that flower farming involves are very different. So I want to kind of better understand, and I've had a couple interviews now with the podcast, to hear what people think about that, what flower specific people think about that and what a soil scientist thinks about that. So to understand whether maybe we need to do low till in flower farming instead of no till. That's one question I had. I also really wanted to know, and I'm going to keep going into this when I do interviews, is just mineral balancing and nutrient balancing for flowers, because that's very different than it is for vegetables. So I feel like, and I could be wrong, as an outsider looking in the veggie world, you guys always are talking about all these like feather meals and rock phosphate and all these things that can kind of apply to flower farming, but we have different nutritional needs for our plants than you guys have for vegetable plants. So, in flower production, you don't want high nitrogen. That'll really screw up flower production. Potassium is important, but not nearly as important for you. Phosphorus is a big deal for us. So I wanted to kind of tease out some information about that, particularly in how it relates to soil biology and how we can work with soil biology. So that's one thing I'm looking at. And then I really wanted to know more about Korean natural farming, KNF. Um, I've been, educating myself on KNF for a little over a year now, and have really started using a lot of applications with great success. And I kind of wanted, that's one thing that doesn't seem to be hardly in flower farming at all yet. But I think it has so much potential to help flower farmers because we deal with a lot of rots, a lot of, bad soil stuff that I think can be really helped by KNF applications like LAB and WCA and stuff like that. So I'm just getting really nerdy, to be honest. Like I just I just have a lot of questions, and I think that I noticed deficits in the information available through other no-till avenues. So I'm just asking a lot of questions. That's it.
It's great, and I'm so excited to put it out into the world because as somebody who's editing that podcast, I've been learning so much about flowers and about the kind of differences in your first episode with Tony Gates
Mm,
with Bear Mountain. Just the stuff that he dives into on Korean natural farming and flowers was really fascinating. Um, so
yeah.
so Ginny Love, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm so excited for our little project.
Oh, thanks, Jesse. It was so fun to talk to you. Obviously, I could go on for hours and hours. There's just so much to learn. So I'm excited about the No Till Flowers podcast too, and I can't wait for everybody to listen.
All right. If you enjoyed that show and you are as pumped about this new podcast series as we are, we will have some links in the show notes where you can find it. You should be able to find No Till Flowers wherever you get your podcasts, and definitely at notillgrowers.com. If you have any trouble locating it, write us. It's at notillgrowers@gmail.com. You can follow Ginny at Love and Fresh Flowers on Instagram and all the places. You can also follow at No Till Flowers on Instagram. And that way you can keep up with when the shows are released and all that good stuff. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're getting it and leave a review. This week, all reviews must consider stem life. That's super important. Otherwise, they won't stick around. They'll die. And people will be like, what's up with this wilty review over here? Anyway, huge thank you to Jackson Roulette and Josh Satin for their help. Big thanks to the musical stylings of Willie Breeding for the theme music. Huge thank you, as always, to Hannah Crabtree, my wife, for all of her support and amazingness. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week. Or, well, maybe sooner than you think. That rhymed. Bye.
I'm excited too. I can't wait to have it out in the world so that I can start getting questions from people. Like, I don't want this to just be about me. I want to be like, the conduit to, the mouthpiece, so to speak, for other people to be able to get their questions out to, whoever's willing to answer. So, like I said, I like to put things out into the universe and see what comes back to me. So that's part of what the podcast is for me too, is just to hear other people's questions and see if we can collectively come up with some answers.